Thank you, Sue. Thank you for really your leadership in organizing today's program. Well, it's a great privilege for me, of course, to welcome Eric Lander, a good friend, and President Biden's Chief Science Advisor and Director of White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Now, Eric is the keynote speaker for our meeting, but as he's always so creative, he decided that he and I should have a fireside chat. And so I would be happy to do this with him. But let me first introduce him. As I said, he's President Biden's Science Advisor and Director of OSTP. But he's formerly the President and Founding Director of the Broad Institute. We all know that well, a research institute that's closely affiliated with MIT, Harvard, and 5 of Boston's major teaching hospitals. Believe me, that's quite a feat. And he's able to bring that together to focus on genomic medicine. Now, Eric was one of the principal leaders of Human Genome Project. And as you know, he's a geneticist, molecular biologist, and a mathematician. That's where he started his career. And he's played a pioneering role in reading, understanding, and biomedical application of a human genome. And he's developed powerful methods for discovering the molecular basis of human disease that are used all over the world. And no surprises, he's received numerous national and international honors for his work. Now, Eric has been a scientific advisor to federal government across multiple administrations. In fact, he was PCAST co-chair to Obama, President Obama. So he has advised not only the White House, but HHS and Department of Defense. So Eric, welcome. Good morning.
Well, hello, Victor. Can you see me?
We can see you in your blue shirt. And
all right. Excellent. Well, the thing you left out, Victor, is I'm also a member of the National Academy of Medicine. And I think it's relevant, and it's why I thought we should do a fireside or a keynote conversation, because I am coming as the President of Science Advisor and all that, but I'm coming as a member of the National Academy of Medicine, of course, too. Because it's a community I know and love, and I just want to say how much I appreciate the NAM has been doing throughout the pandemic and thinking hard about questions related to public health and climate. And so it's great to kick off a conversation with you, and I hear you might even take a couple of questions from the membership as well.
Yes, we will do that as well. So I think what we should do is look at our conversation in 3 parts, although totally interrelated. First of all, I'm going to ask you a question about how you see science forward in the future. And secondly, I want you to talk a little bit more about pandemic preparedness and public health. And third, about climate. I know these are all things that you're working on and PCAST is working on. So Eric, in 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt authored a letter to his science advisor, Dr. Vannevar Bush. He asked the question how science and technology could be best applied to benefit the nation's health, economic prosperity, and national security in decades that followed the Second World War. And as you know, Dr. Bush's response came in the form of a seminal report called Science, the Endless Frontier, that would set the course of scientific discovery in America for the next 75 years. And I just want to read a quote from what he wrote. He said, the most important way in which the government can promote industrial research are to increase the flow of new scientific knowledge through support of basic research and to aid in development of scientific talent. Well, you all know this Prisian report was a guiding force for changes in science and innovation in our country for decades that led to the modernization of American Research University, the creation of NSF, and later NIH, and many others, and shaped much of our science policy. So much has happened. And of course, when you were appointed, or at least selected, shall we say, and then later confirmed as the science advisor to President Biden, he wrote you a similar letter on January 15th and asked you about 5 questions. Questions about what can we learn about pandemic and address the needs of public health? And we'll come to that as kind of second part of our conversation. How can breakthrough science technology create powerful new solutions to address climate change? That's our third topic. And here he's saying, how can we assure the United States is world leader in technology industry of the future? Also critical to our economic prosperity, national security, and competition, in which case he listed China. So I want you to talk about that. And of course, how can you guarantee the fruits of science technology can be shared across America, among all Americans, and what is the long-term health of science technology in our nation? So Eric, 75 years, what next 75 years will look like?
Well, Victor, thank you for calling attention to this wonderful letter that President Biden sent. It's formally addressed to me, but it's actually addressed to the entire community of science and technology. And I don't mean just people who happen to have degrees in or work in jobs of science and technology, but people who care about it. So, the president entrusted me with providing an answer back to him, but it's all of us who have to think about these questions. So you said that Vannevar Bush produced this amazing report, Science, the Endless Frontier, and he called attention to the importance of the centrality in our strategy of continued commitment to producing new scientific knowledge and new talent. And of course, that's going to have to continue. But you're asking, well, what goes on in the next 75 years? Well, for one thing, the science itself, I think, it just has so much possibility right now. There is so much that we look ahead that we couldn't even imagine a couple of decades ago. I'll give a couple of examples, but I won't mostly talk about scientific possibilities, but I can't help emphasizing it to say how much science continues to transform itself, and that this fundamental frame that Vannevar Bush set out is correct. I think about in the field of biology and medicine, the transition of biology to being a digital science with digital information is now leading to the idea of programmable biology, programmable medicine. This is a really important transformation that's been happening over the coming decades. From being able to read out the genome, digital information that encodes the genes and all of that information, to then more recently reading out all the variation in the human population, to then reading out how the genes are read out, the RNA expression patterns and all the cell types in the body as is going on, to then being able to read out and understand regulatory programs. We're not there yet, but we're gonna get to a deep, maybe comprehensive understanding about how to read out regulation. And then what will happen is, and is beginning to happen already, that people will think about, how do you program cells? How do you put in a patch to the code that might do something to help, make a cell that's become insulin insensitive become more insulin sensitive? You can think about doing that. If you think about this in a digital way, you can think about it with nucleic acids carrying instructions, anywhere from the temporary and RNA to a more permanent sort of thing. And we will see people who write code for cells. We see it already in this pandemic with mRNA vaccines, and the idea that one can sit down rather rapidly and write code. And one can ask, can I do this for cancer? Could I make cancer vaccines? What else could be done? With digital reading, can I do cancer diagnostics in quite general ways with reading things out, say from annual blood tests? They're just a swirl of ideas that I think even those of us who are close to the world of genomics never could have predicted just how far those ideas would go. And they'll go even further than what I can imagine today because of this basic investment in fundamental knowledge and talent. So I'm excited about that. And outside our own fields, just in the past several months, I'm excited about things like fusion energy. something that was talked about since I was an undergraduate student, well, now is really getting legs. And there are dozens of startups in fusion who might actually make working fusion reactors that really could contribute. So there is no end to this endless frontier. I think we've confirmed the endlessness of this frontier. But we could also think about, what did Vannevar Bush not get in that report? What did he not think of, and what did he maybe, well, just really, what did he not think of? I think there are a lot of things that have to be said, and they really go to the heart of what President Biden has asked us all to do, which is to reimagine and reinvigorate the science and technology strategy for the next 75 years, give or take to the end of this century. And look, one of the first is Vannevar Bush's vision of science was a very elitist vision. It was a vision of work done at a very limited number of elite institutions, largely done by the kind of scientists he knew, which were largely white male scientists working in these kinds of institutions. And I think it's clear we're not going to succeed unless we really open up that vision dramatically, because science hasn't been welcoming to people with regard to gender, to race, to having the resources to go into science. And with regard to region, science is still very regionally biased into where it takes place, highly concentrated in the Northeast and the West Coast. And when President Biden writes, how do we ensure the participation of all Americans in science itself and in the benefits of science, we really need to take that seriously, because it's both the right thing to do, but it's going to be essential to our succeeding as a nation. And so we need people around the table participating in science who are going to ask a wide variety of different questions and bring different perspectives. And I think this is one of the single most important things we have to do, is take seriously that this has to be a whole of country, all Americans from all backgrounds. I know this is something the National Academy of Medicine thinks a lot about, but I just want to emphasize that at the White House, this has become a very major focus as well. And we are hoping early in the new year to come out with some really specific things we can do to help accelerate this. I think other things that were not as apparent to Vannevar Bush are the need to take on collective problems that require global cooperation. Issues like solving pandemics can't be done in a city alone, in a country alone. It takes a world working together. Climate takes a world working together. This was not the case in the time of Franklin Roosevelt. Our problems are so much more interconnected, and that is going to require thinking about science differently. They also involve scale that is different. An awful lot of the early NSF that Vannevar Bush conceived was about individual investigators at the bench. We still need that. It's obviously the lifeblood, for sure. But we now need to understand how to build great portfolios of projects of all different sizes, because we can't be afraid to take on larger scale problems if that's what it's going to take. And we have to preserve individual creativity even within the large scale problems.
Exactly.
Too. So there are important things about the sociology here, and industry has become an important font of discovery. And we have to think about the spectrum across academia to industry in terms of what can be done and ensuring the openness of all this. Vannevar Bush's world was a simpler world with regard to these things. Much of the science took place on your lab bench or in your institute.
Exactly, right.
So, also, I got to say, in 1944 and the post-war years, the U.S. was sort of the only game in town with regard to science and technology. There was no serious competition for the United States. Well, we're now in a world where everybody has read the playbook, and many countries are actively participating in science and technology. And there's even serious competition in many ways in science and technology. And for the United States to succeed, we need to think about how we ensure that we succeed on a global stage by, of course, including everybody within the US, but also thinking about the alliances, making sure that we view this as not just Team USA, but reaching out and working closely with allies and having it be easy for people to come into the US to do science and to share ideas and projects. And, you know, the United States has to remain the most attractive destination for scientists all over the world to come and practice science, be trained and do science. I note that of the Nobel Prizes this year in the sciences, of the Americans who received Nobel Prizes, all but one was an immigrant to this country. And so we are stronger and the world is stronger when we keep open those borders. And maybe the last thing I'll say on this picture for this next 75 years, and this is still a work in progress, and I want to hear from everybody about what we should say to President Biden about the strategy. But something else that I don't think Vannevar Bush thought enough about at the time was public trust, the need to earn public trust. Maybe after World War II, it wasn't much of an issue. The public just trusted scientists for a lot of reasons, including sometimes missteps by science itself and sometimes through misinformation. We really have serious issues about trust. And trust is going to require us approaching this with humility. We can't just say, oh, the public doesn't get it. We have to first ask, are we truly including? Are we truly making sure that science benefits all? Are we speaking clearly? And we need to earn that trust every day, and we need to bring a humility and a persistence to it. So these are some of my initial thoughts about the response to President Biden. They will get more refined and we'll actually write something at some point, but I don't want to do it too soon before we hear from everybody. So this part's an open invitation to everybody to join in this.
Well, Eric, I know that you have been very inclusive, highly consultative as you think about the future. You've always been a visionary, but I think you're certainly now listening to many other ideas that coming from different parts. Love to hear your idea of inclusion and equity, which I think is so important. And really looking at science from a much broader perspective than from a few. But you know, as you said, 75 years, science has changed tremendously. I mean, you emphasize the nature of science has changed from individual scientists to teamwork, right? Much larger labs, convergent science, the rise of open data, open science, and big facilities. But you know, there are many scientists who says funding is getting more difficult. As individuals working in teams, how do I get recognized? And as you said, there are many other considerations where I'd like to come back. But what do you say to the scientists, particularly younger people that you've mentored so many of them, how this will prepare them for the future, and how by looking at your vision of how science should move forward, that they in fact will have a great opportunity and great future in it?
Well, the opportunities for a young person coming into science today are so huge. I just think of how much information is at their disposal, how much technology is at their disposal to ask really deep questions. You know, my own career slogging to get a sequence for one gene or identify a particular gene. People can now take much bigger pictures at things. And yet at the same time, you know, it is always challenging and has become even more challenging to start up a lab, to figure out how to work in teams. I think it's incumbent on us who have been in the system for a while to really address these issues that can make science the most satisfying career, which is individuals, however they're working, whether they're, you know, alone at a lab bench or in teams, can really exercise their full creativity and get real credit. And that requires rethinking a lot of our rules. I mean, everything from why in the world the authorship of a paper is a linear string, for example, when credit is not a rank-ordered thing. I think we ought to be asking fundamental questions about the rewards of science. How often young scientists need to be going back to the well for another little grant and another little grant. And so I think if we're going to keep the ecosystem of science truly vibrant, we're going to have to be prepared to think about all the components, these components of how we think science is done. They're not ancient, traditions. They were all invented within the last 75 years. They can be reinvented. We should think really creatively about that. The sharing of ideas, pre-publication, through archives and things like that. They are not without problems, but they open up all sorts of ways to speed the sharing of information. And yeah, we'll then have to deal with the fact that sometimes that information might be premature and not right. So I see a lot of frankly, the same innovation that we do at our bench, we have to do to science itself. We should view science as a thing that we apply science to.
Yeah. Eric, recently I participated in a meeting that you hosted about, particularly in research security and relations with China. I know that you certainly believe in global collaboration, as you said, about global talent. How do we compete with China, and what are the concerns about the security?
Well, look, of course, there are concerns about security. Let me say that first. There are instances where China has sought to unfairly gain access to non-public information and has engaged in things, in some cases, that should be regarded as industrial espionage. This is very concerning. It abuses the system. And there are appropriate things to do to make sure that we have research security. I feel strongly about that. We have to ask people to disclose their contacts. And that kind of disclosure, whether it's about foreign contacts or frankly just conflicts of interest. When you're writing a paper, what companies do you have stock in and things like that? Disclosure is a very important part. But all that said, I'm also worried about going too far, saying that, well, let's take the most extreme case, which sometimes happens, scientists of Asian descent being targets of suspicion, Americans of Asian descent being targets of suspicion simply because they're of Asian descent, because they might have family in China, because they might have friends in China. I think we have to be very careful that the solution to research security does not end up cutting us off from what is our greatest superpower, which is that the US is the magnet for the best people in the world to come here and to collaborate and to interact. So xenophobia in all its forms, especially against people, against Americans, people working in America, is unacceptable. We should be very open to having people from around the world work in this country. And we have to balance this. We, of course, have to take security seriously. And we have to take very seriously that it is our openness that has been our greatest strength and will be our greatest strength. If we erect some barrier around the United States to keep it safe, we will guarantee that it will decline because it will not have the lifeblood of intellectual discourse that drives science.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. But let's turn our topic to lessons learned from pandemic. I know President Biden asked you about what are lessons learned and implications for science, medicine, and public health. And I want to talk to you about this, but also the fact that the American Preparedness Plan, love to have you say a few words about that as well.
Well, there are so many lessons from the pandemic. One of them was, how can we avoid having future pandemics? That's one we took up as one of our first things here. And we released in September the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan, which lays out an aspect of that, how we can transform our capabilities. There are other aspects, like what we can do about public health, which is incredibly important and we're working on. This report is on how to transform our capabilities, because I think this pandemic appeared at a very striking moment. Had it been 5 years ago, we would not have had the tools that we had to do things like make mRNA vaccines or some of the diagnostics that got made. But 5 years from now, we ought to be able to do much better, much, much better. And so this pandemic showed us the challenges of the pandemic in so many ways: scientific and medical challenges, public health challenges, equity challenges, because of course the burden of this pandemic fell so disproportionately on marginalized and vulnerable communities. Each of those needs attention. Let me pick up this first, that was in the first report here on capabilities. We need to be able to generate vaccines in 100 days. Well-tested, approved vaccines in 100 days. Okay, it took us 314 days to generate an approval of the first. That's amazingly good compared to anything in the past, and yet for the future won't be good enough. Imagine we had done this in 100 days. It would have meant in the spring of 2020 there were already vaccines, and what that would have meant to millions of lives. We also need to make sure that we have enough vaccine to vaccinate the entire world within the next 100 days. Can we do this? Can we do this whatever virus hits us next? Well, we're going to have to take it seriously. There are 26 families of human viruses. We've got to be prepared for all. We've got to be able to know, in some ways we were a little lucky that this was a coronavirus compared to other choices because we knew more about coronaviruses, but luck is not a plan. We need to be able to make vaccines that will help us against viruses that mutate even faster, or might put in multiple antigens. And I could go on. And this plan for members of the Academy, there's a scientific appendix that talks about this. We need to think about therapeutics, about small molecules that can complement vaccines, that could inhibit polymerases and proteases from all these viral families, and that might even be developed in advance so we would have them available when a pandemic hits. We need diagnostics. I mean, ultimately, and I'm not very patient about this, we would like diagnostics that are super cheap, under $1, so cheap that every American could do it every day at home, know if they had an infection and seek care rather than having to go out somewhere to find a test. We have to keep our mind focused on this rather than forgetting about that. We need early warning systems where we're actually able to monitor. I'm not sure that we should ever tolerate this idea of unexplained fevers. The patient came in with a fever that wasn't explained. Well, maybe we should view part of medicine and public health that, we're going to run a simple diagnostic test, and if it's something we recognize, it's the circulating flu, great. And if it falls out of all the knowns, we got to go send it off for sequencing to see if there are unknowns circulating. Yeah. Why do we take for granted many things, like everybody has a thermometer in their house. Yeah. Well, we might want to begin to think that there are a lot of other things we should take for granted. Right. There's, of course, public health. Strongly, we need to be able to do so much better on public health. Our public health system, we do not support adequately. The connections between the federal, the state, and the local levels, it's clear from what happened here, are not strong enough and need to be rethought. And OSDP is now working in parallel on an effort to figure out what we can do about really strengthening public health. And this is not, in my opinion, mostly for the next pandemic, because mostly it's for every day. A lot of the solutions that are needed make a difference every day, and we shouldn't do that as for over the horizon for a future pandemic, which is why we put it in a different bucket right now that we're working on. The things I was saying first were kind of fundamentally about pandemic preparedness, or they'll have effects every day. This is about something that's fundamentally about every day, getting our public health. And I could go on. I advise anybody who's interested in this to read this report. We take it very seriously.
Yeah, this morning in the New York Times, the front page says, threats, resignation, and 100 new laws, why public health is in crisis, right? So I think clearly that we need to reimagine public health, but being able to give it the authority and ability to do its job. And there's so much interference now, right?
Yeah. And I can say that PCAST is extremely interested in this question. PCAST has now stood up at its first meeting where the pandemic came up, and I expect that PCAST will also be weighing in on this. And I gotta say, a lot of our thoughts are informed by very good work the Academy has been doing on this. So starting with what the National Academy of Medicine has done on public health is going to be a very important foundation for what we do, but we all need to be thinking hard about this.
Well, I wish I can keep talking to you for a long time. I've got a list of questions this long.
Well, you can, Victor, just not now. But we'll have more opportunities to talk and more opportunities to talk with members of the Academy. Before we end, let me just say to everybody, we need everybody on this. Whatever else you are doing, this is a special moment right now with regard to public health, medicine generally in the wake of this pandemic. And everybody who's part of this meeting should be thinking about what they contribute. At OSTP, we're very eager to hear from everybody because all the assignments we have from the president, you are included, I think, on the CC line implicitly. So please do your part.
Eric, I do want to ask you about climate. So that, in fact, is also on the agenda. So tell us what you're thinking. How can science and innovation help us address the issue of climate change and its negative consequences?
Look, there are so many ways in which science can play a role, but let me sort a few of them just very quickly. There are technologies that are here and now, and we need to deploy them. And science plays a significant role in that, because even though you might say the technology is here and now, solar panels are now producing electricity even more cheaply than fossil fuels. That's just remarkable. It's fallen tenfold in cost. Wind has fallen dramatically in cost. There are things that we should just be out there deploying, but even figure out how to connect grids that can handle power flowing in both directions, not just from the central power plant, but from power being generated in different sites and sent back onto the grid. It's an amazing systems problem. It's going to require systems engineers. So science is going to play a big role in this deployment. Regulatory policies will, incentives will, all that. But all these pieces will require science to really work as a system. But then let me just leap over the horizon over the horizon, you can even imagine things like I mentioned, like fusion energy. I mean, if in fact we can see fusion reactors become practical, well, you think about it. These are things that require nothing special in the way of fuel. They produce no long-term high-level radioactive waste. They inherently are not that expensive to build. They'll be expensive at the beginning, but they have no expensive pieces to them. And one wonders, do they or other technologies have the ability to get us to, for example, ultra-cheap electricity? And if you have ultra-cheap electricity, what other climate problems can you solve? Well, then you start thinking about steel making. The big problem there, a lot of it can be solved with ultra-cheap electricity. Or what about, fuels for jet planes or ships? Well, if you had super cheap electricity, you might be able to make it out of carbon dioxide from the air to produce fuels. Well, there's a tremendous amount that policymakers are going to have to do and the Congress will have to do. But in the end, it's up to scientists and technologists to do their part, which is ultimately, it's not going to happen immediately, but ultimately to make net zero carbon energy cheaper than any alternative. In the long run, the world will ultimately abandon fossil fuels when in fact everything else is, when the net zero solutions are just plain more efficient and cheaper and available to everybody. That's the kinds of things that scientists should be thinking about and dreaming about. Believe me, in the interim, countries have to get together and work to decrease carbon emissions. They have to have the right kind of regulations in place, et cetera. But for the long future, ultimately, science has the ability to take the problem off the table by saying there are just plain better solutions that not only don't produce greenhouse gases, but they're actually more efficient and let people around the world have more energy. We want people to have more energy for prosperity in their countries. We want to have it without pollution, so we can attend to the very important questions of environmental justice. We want all of these things, and it's only scientists in the end that can do that. And so we have to do our part of it. And it comes from dreaming about possibilities and going to the bench and working on it. I know it's not that most of the members of the National Academy of Medicine will do those sort of things, but it's what we all do as scientists and technologists, and we need it.
Eric, as I said, I can talk to you forever, but time is running out. I do want to thank you for those inspiring conversations. You know, when I think about this, what you really emphasize is not only the technology and the possibilities, but the benefits it must have to society, and the importance of inclusion and dealing with mistrust. And I think one other area I know you care a lot about, you and I spoke about this, is to look at science as mitigating the risk and harm they could do as we have amazing emerging technologies. The issue of ethics, the issue of equity, the issue of accessibility, you name it. And we had many conversations about this, and I know you have a broad sense of science in this way, including social science, behavioral science, many others.
And Victor, this is why it's so important to have everybody at the table, because we can think of amazing technologies. We have to work as hard to think about all the ways that they might possibly go wrong, and how they might hurt people, how we could build technologies that could, facial recognition technologies that could discriminate against Black Americans. Well, you frankly have to have people at the table who are going to be, empowered and have the perspective to say that. We have technologies and problems that have the potential for great advantage, but we need to have more women at the table. We need to have everybody at the table, because if we're going to make sure that these technologies serve everybody, we have to look at the upsides together. We have to look at the downsides. And if you ask me about how do we build trust in science, it's by being totally open about the fact that, yes, science can sometimes have downsides. And we know that, and we care about that, and we work on it. I think it's that level of honesty and commitment to addressing that and including everybody in addressing that is the foundation for any trust. If somebody comes and tells you, oh, just trust me, I'm a scientist, I have all your best interests at heart, I want to run the other way. If somebody says, please be part of the problem, this has got such a potential upside, and yet we've got to be careful not to get the things wrong, I want to sit down and talk to them, and even more so for people who come from marginalized groups who have every right to be suspicious.
So, Eric, thank you for leading the nation in science and being the chief scientist of our nation, and really being the advisor to President Biden and working as member of his cabinet. I just want to thank you, and thank you for all the things you've done yourself for science, but now, of course, you'll be doing it in much broader way for a nation and globally. I'd like to turn it over to Sue, but certainly want to give you a big round of applause.
And to you, Victor.
Thank you. Sue?